The media is not here for your safety or entertainment.
The world of picture television brings us the news of the world through two central news agencies called Reuters and the Associated Press. The Rothschilds bought Reuters in the 1800s, which later bought the Associated Press and made the Rothschild family owners of the world's largest central news services. To the present day, the world depends on these Rothschild-owned central news services as their main source of news and information.
We rely on the world's elites for our information.
The bankster-owned media conglomerates include weapons manufacturers General Electric and Westinghouse, which profit from promoting wars. Control over the internet, publishing, recording, and top cable companies can be traced back to the same big five media empires: General Electric, Time Warner, Viacom,
Disney. That's interesting considering what we know about their current day agendas.
But they're all coming from the same ventriloquist. Every TV show needs corporate sponsors, and corporate sponsors sponsor pro-business, pro-government programming, and journalists who support the agenda of the big five media owners. While two-thirds of the world goes hungry, these banksters offer gazillion-dollar sponsorships to sports athletes to play with their balls. Why? Because they keep the masses distracted from the important...
Everything is a distraction from who really owns the world and what is really going on. Really, this is a danger to our democracy.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, we all know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
Responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the coverage and irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous.
Maybe it's time we all start thinking for ourselves.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
First, the severe flooding here in the Northeast as more rain continues to fall today. NBC's Michelle Kaczynski, I guess she's in a canoe, is in Wayne, New Jersey this morning.
Hey,
Michelle, good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, obviously we're getting a nice break from the rain, but not the flooding. This is essentially now a part of the Passaic River in this neighborhood. It rushed in yesterday.
The lies are everywhere, and they were paid for by the same people profiting off you viewing the lies.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to
They
control
figured out
general
from an early stage that it would be easy to control us if they just told us what to think and what was happening.
The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization. The council...
It's almost as if groups and organizations run the world.
For 2 years, Professor Carol Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR
Sounds like they're talking about our favorite words on this channel, New World Order.
Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights...
Granted, this is an older video. Some of you may not recognize these faces, but Barbara Walters was allegedly on the Epstein flight list to Epstein Island. And make no mistake, there are new faces in new organizations doing the same thing that these people were doing 10, 15 years ago.
In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again...
Who remembers AOL and their many subscribers in the dark times of internet? What companies do you think compare now? Apple? Samsung?
Have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal.
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
Does that last scene remind anybody of anyone? Let me give you a hint. This guy and his proceedings. History really does repeat itself.
Blanket opt-in to share their privacy data with any third-party users.
Congresswoman, yes, that's how our platform works. You have to opt in to sign into any app before you use it.
Well, let me just add that it is a minefield in order to do that. And you have to make it transparent, clear, in pedestrian language, just once. This is what we will do with your data. Do you want this to happen or not? So I think that this is being blurred. I think you know what I mean by it. Are you aware of other third-party information mishandlings that have not been disclosed?
Congresswoman, no. Although we are currently going...